We know journalists always strive for objectivity, but condoning of violence against women can still happen inadvertently through language choice. How you describe the subject and object and the verbs you use can significantly change your story. The evidence shows that there are common ways the media represents perpetrators. These may change the way the public understands violence against women, make it look more acceptable, or can actually drive further violence. Dr. Innocent Mwatsiya, Research Fellow at Trobe University.
Language does not just describe our environment or our world, it creates our world. So the ways that we speak about people or ourselves does not just describe those people, but it creates how we think about those people. It creates how we think about ourselves as well. So I think the language that is used in the media can be either, inviting or alienating men as being worse off or, being part of the solution. It depends on what language that we use. And I think that speaks to the idea of using language that's quite clear and language that holds systems accountable to victim survivors who've got lived experiences.
Dr. Hayley Boxall, Criminologist and Research Fellow at the ANU.
We actually have a lot of research which has told us it's really important how we talk about people who are using unacceptable behaviours, including abusive and violent behaviours, because how we talk about these individuals, including in the media, tells them and the community a lot about how we perceive and understand their behaviours. In the media, when we talk about men who use abusive behaviours, we've kind of seen these two polar opposites kind of emerge. In the one instance, we have traditionally, I guess, talked about DV perpetrators as good men who snapped effectively. So we're kind of communicating this idea that men who use violence and abuse, that they were not the problem, that the victim was. And we're feeding into these stereotypes of good men who snapped because they love their partners or their kids too much. And by kind of using this language, which Jane Gilmore in particular has been really helpful in unpacking the way that we kind of are unconsciously or consciously feeding into these masculine tropes of why men use violence, we're really telling men who use these behaviours that we have sympathy for them and we understand their behaviours and the victim is the problem. And understandably, we've become very dissatisfied with that language, and Our Watch has provided some really helpful guidance around how we should avoid some of that language.
Dr. Bianca Fileborn, Research Professor in Criminology at the University of Melbourne.
Some of the research that I've been involved in with Sophie Hines, looking at Me Too reporting, found really analogous results. There was a small subset of reporting that was really good and really progressive. And then I would say the majority that was really perpetuating myths around pursuing sex is just what real men do, and sexual violence is a man jumping out of the bushes, raping a woman in an alleyway, rather than often occurring in the context of interpersonal relationships and, without overt physical violence and so forth. So collectively, I think this reporting can really contribute towards a broader cultural backdrop that normalizes and excuses sexual harassment and gender-based violence. So, really, I think the key takeaway for me, for any journalist, is that what you're saying and how you're framing this issue really matters. And it really has an impact.
When we say that men who commit violence are good guys who just snapped or who are under pressure, it reaffirms the idea that the violence is accidental, incidental, or related to mental health issues or substance use. The evidence says that reinforcing factors play a role in some instances of violence, but they do not drive violence. This language also fails to mention that these men choose to use violence. On the other hand, calling people thugs, monsters, or cowards shames and dehumanizes them. This makes it easier to see them as outliers, rather than as a product of our society, or something we are all responsible for. The evidence says this type of reporting can also lead to further violence. Feelings of shame, fear, and guilt act as barriers for men who need to seek help, and can provoke denial and other defensive reactions from men. Dr. Stephanie Lusby, Research Manager at Respect Victoria.
There's still a lot of work to be done around disrupting the narrative of perpetrators as monsters or outliers whose behaviour is entirely separate from the norms set by the rest of society. So we need to be able to show what everyone has a role to play in prevention actually looks like for men.
Dr. Hayley Boxall.
We started talking about men who use abusive behaviours as monsters or thugs or cowards. And this is really problematic, but for different reasons. So when we use language like this, we are telling people that if they use these behaviors, that they will be socially ostracized and vilified. And it's very shaming kind of language. The research has really strongly shown us that language like monsters, thugs, cowards is actually really unhelpful, because we're kind of saying that people are these behaviors. We're not separating the behavior from the person. And that really communicates quite strongly what we think as a community about rehabilitation and redemption, because can a monster really change? Probably not. So the idea is that when we're trying to use shaming language, we should be shaming the behavior, not the person. Shaming language is also really unhelpful when we don't provide an alternative self that people can aspire to. And this kind of taps into what everyone's been talking about alternative masculinities. Because if someone's identity and sense of masculinity in self is tied in with their use of violence, if you shame this part of them, and in particular call them a coward, well, it kind of raises this question of, well, who am I if I'm not violent? How can I perform masculinity if I don't use abusive behaviors? And so what this really means is that we need to provide alternative masculinities.
When interviewing a perpetrator about their rehabilitation, don't just report their claim that they have changed. Speak with an expert in men's behaviour change to share the underlying causes and patterns of men's violence and controlling behaviours. They can explain how their work changes men's behaviour by focusing on accountability, responsibility, and promoting safer relationships. Where it is safe and appropriate, always seek input from the victim survivor to understand their perspective and ensure balanced reporting. Dr. Jenna Price, journalist and columnist.
What happens when someone is being interviewed about their rehabilitation? I always think it's really important to reach out to the victim to say, what do you think about all of this? Because people can make all kinds of claims about how they're much better people now. They've done this work, they've reconstituted themselves, they've done all this rehabilitation. You can't know until the victim's had a word with you. And I think that person has always got to be included. And I mean, I would have avoided some of the more egregious errors I made early in my career if I'd followed my current advice. So it's a thing that I really recommend people do.
Dr. Hayley Boxall.
We know from research the naming and shaming campaigns can actually make things a hell of a lot worse. But one of the things that we know about this is that it actually also means that it kind of creates shame for people who have friends and family members who might be using these abusive behaviors, which blocks off those opportunities for caring conversations or curious conversations where people who don't use abusive behaviors can actually talk to family members and friends about these uses of behaviors, which can start the change process. So yeah, I guess what the research really says is language is really, really powerful, and the role of the media in communicating to the community as well as to people who are using these abusive behaviors, how we view and understand and accept these behaviors is really, really important.
For more information on accurately portraying perpetrators when reporting on violence against women, see ourwatch.org.au.